From time to time we fell to the ground and crawled through the undergrowth on our bellies, and then flung ourselves from shelter to shelter. After a while we were able to reach a deep crevice dug in a clay ravine. There we found several villagers who were listening fearfully to the sounds of battle. Their faces were agitated. Apparently the villagers had been warned in advance of the impending attack, and the villagers had crawled into a crevice to wait out the battle, disregarding the presence of the frightened civilians. We climbed up the slope of the ravine. From this elevated vantage point we could see the Russians scurrying around the warehouse building at a distance of about 300 meters. I took careful aim from behind a tree and fired a few shots at the silhouettes of the Russians with my carbine. Suddenly Gartman shouted that reinforcements were coming to us. A company of infantry and part of the now dispersed unit, previously stationed close to us, had gathered on the western edge of the village. Gartman and I dashed through the bushes down to the road and saw our company commander carrying his motorcycle and sidecar through the village. We could hear Russian shells bursting far behind us. Our heavy guns were shelling the banks of the Dnieper to cut off the Russian retreat. Our attacking companies went on the offensive. Not 30 minutes later, after scouring the surrounding area, I reattached the bolt to the breech block of our gun. A few hours later, our counterattacks drove the enemy back to the river. The survivors, who on rafts and boats tried to reach a safe place on the eastern bank, came under fire from our artillery. Having repulsed the attack of the enemy, whose forces outnumbered ours 4 or 5 times, we began to search for the wounded lieutenant. Although we searched all around, we were unable to locate him. We found only the officer's bloody boot near a burned-out warehouse. While we were searching for the officer, we came across a Russian soldier husking sunflower seeds in a garden near one of the mud brick houses with a thatched roof. He offered no resistance, raised his hands high in a sign that he was surrendering, and cautiously approached us, looking around fearfully. After a perfunctory search, he was sent to regimental headquarters for interrogation. The next morning, soldiers of a rifle company reported the discovery of an unidentified body at the confluence of a stream into the Dnieper. Later, we learned from the company commander that it was the corpse of a lieutenant executed by a shot to the back of the head. No traces of the 2 missing soldiers of one of the infantry platoons were found. Most likely they were taken prisoner and taken across the Dnieper. A Russian military doctor taken prisoner in Kiev after the encirclement testified that German prisoners captured in the area were executed before the Russians left the city. Later rumors reached us that on the night when the attack was launched, the village school teacher and Olga, a Komsomol girl, under cover of darkness, escaped unnoticed through a gully and swam across a wide river. Having reached the Russian positions, they provided the Soviet troops with detailed information about our deployment and numbers, and then secretly led the Russian battalion across the river. Our place of lodging was near a bridge that would allow us to cross the ravine and enter the village. The inhuman character of the war in the East was beginning to show itself. Nevertheless, none of us could have foreseen or realized that the sense of bitterness and rage of the Russians at the attack on their country would grow stronger year by year. A large part of the civilian population was uncomfortable with such ideas of retaliation, especially in the southern sector of the Eastern Front, where we were treated comparatively well. Many Russian soldiers taken prisoner early in the campaign expressed a desire to fight alongside us against Stalin and the Soviet government. Over time, the Soviet leadership abandoned the call to sacrifice themselves in the name of communism and tried to appeal to the innate patriotism of the people. It became the patriotic duty of everyone without exception to defend Mother Russia from the invasion of the fascist invaders. So the conflict grew into a war of the Russian people against the German aggressors, rather than a struggle for the survival of the party. Unfortunately, the brutal actions of the Russians are comparable to the behavior of the German occupiers in the rear areas, far behind the front line, because of the extremely harsh actions toward the Russians. To the average Russian, the German soldier became a supporter of and fighter for a despicable, bloody political organization. Thanks to this doctrine created and preached in distant Berlin, Numerous acts of atrocities were committed in retaliation against the frontline soldiers, even though we, the frontline soldiers, were unaware of the extermination of thousands of innocent people by the Sonderkommandos faithfully serving the system, or of the extraordinary measures used by the golden pheasants of the National Socialist Party to pacify the occupied territories. The frontline division commanders, as well as officers at the level of regimental and battalion commander, were at that time veterans who had taken part in World War I. Their behaviour and methods of warfare characterised the First World War. Their conduct and methods of warfare were characterised by the impeccable integrity instilled in the officer corps of the Kaiser's army. It should be added that during the whole campaign in the East, I did not know a single case when surrendered Russian soldiers were not treated properly, or wounded Russians captured were not given medical care on an equal footing with us. During the Kanev offensive, prisoners were sent to the rear without any escort, as every man available was urgently needed on the front line. In any case, I am sure that many communists and Russian patriots, sent in this way to the rear along with a crowd of other prisoners, did not miss the opportunity to escape and after a while join the ranks of the ever-growing partisan units. Well-organized partisan formations would become a greater and greater danger to our rear areas. In the course of the war, the people began to trust and support the partisans to a great extent, and they could find shelter and protection everywhere. Throughout the first half of September, we continued to defend our positions on the banks of the Dnieper, while the Russians tried to recapture the western bank. On September 14, our advanced units forced the river. After reconnoitering on one of the Dnieper islands north of Balika, the paratroopers successfully carried out the landing, and the Soviet fortifications on the coastal heights were taken. Despite stubborn enemy resistance, many prisoners were captured. 2 days later, our company, remaining in reserve, followed the advanced units and landed on the opposite shore. Taking advantage of the confusion of the enemy troops, we successfully captured a wide bridgehead, which continued to expand as other units crossed the river and entered the gap. German artillery batteries were continuously firing from Khodorov at enemy positions on the opposite bank, and at the same time the line of fire ran along a tributary of the Dnieper near Balika. By nightfall, the forward units reached the vicinity of Yashnikov. On September 17, the 438th Infantry Regiment, which had been replenished, captured another bridgehead near Balika and Reshishev from the weakened but stubbornly resisting enemy, trying to make contact with the advanced units of the other corps on the road leading to Yerkovsy. The goal of the offensive was achieved by evening, when the last pockets of resistance were eliminated. We continued to tear forward, approaching the road leading from Kiev to the Yerkovsy area of prime importance, thus cutting off the Russians' most important route of retreat. During the night we hardly got any rest as we burrowed into the hard earth, fortifying our positions, lurking strenuously in the damp air until dawn. We got soaked. From the direction of the enemy positions, the rumbling of vehicles and clanking of armour reached us incessantly. During the whole day of September 18, we continued to strengthen our positions, despite the fact that everything had quieted down on the enemy's fortifications and no great movement was noticed. As dusk fell, we felt safe, for we knew that the Soviet units had withdrawn farther east, leaving only cover groups to hold back our advance. Suddenly it became light with the bursting of artillery shells. 11 enemy attacks were repulsed along the Rogozov-Pereyaslav road in the area of Yerkovsy, northeast of them, between 10:20 May and 2:50 AMA. So at dawn, countless corpses dressed in protective brown uniforms became visible, lying in piles in front of our positions. From the burning armoured vehicles to the sky rose clouds of black oily smoke. We received information that several motorized units of the enemy were completely destroyed, and the regiment headquarters proudly gave us a list of captured military equipment. 16 machine guns, 6 heavy artillery pieces, 9 trucks, 2 ambulances and 6 tractors. 400 men were taken prisoner, and by September 19 the number had risen to 800. Several detachments of the 436th Infantry Regiment which had been ordered to clear the eastern bank of remaining enemy troops, also accomplished the task with few casualties. Over the next few days, combing the banks of the Dnieper River, we captured over 1,000 prisoners. Convinced that the Soviet Union had been defeated in the war, the deserters hijacked boats and crossed the Dnieper under cover of darkness in an attempt to distance themselves from the Red Army. People dressed in rags, who alone or in small groups approached our positions with their arms raised, became a familiar sight. Our confidence that the war would be over before the onset of frost continued to grow. On September 23, a large force of Russian infantry suddenly attacked our battalion. We were able to repel the attack, suffering minor casualties, and the enemy was driven back, leaving several light field guns and many small arms on the battlefield. We remained in our positions until word came that the opposite bank of the Dnieper had been cleared of enemy troops. Our division was ordered to advance to this sector. At the end of the fighting to the south and southeast of Kiev, the increasing losses of our troops were counted. The losses of each company averaged from 15 to 20% of their composition, and each infantry company of the 437th Infantry Regiment had lost an average of 4 men killed, 2 missing, 4 wounded and 2 sick over the previous 2 months, for a total of 22 men. The strength of our anti-tank company before the start of the operation was between 100 and 120 men. The condition of military equipment and weapons remained relatively good. The fact that during the basic course of combat training we were constantly hammered into our heads the idea of the need to keep in good condition of the material part. The supply of food and supplies from the rear to the troops became a very conventional concept. So the troops learned to supply themselves with everything necessary at the expense of the conquered territory and captured resources of the enemy. With the beginning of the thawing season, the front units quickly realized that Russian carts with horses in them were more reliable than the heavy horse-drawn wagons of our army, designed for paved roads. More and more Russian horse-drawn wagons were used from among the captured trophy property, or often requisitioned without authorization, contrary to non-admissible instructions from the civilian population. Our 14th Anti-Tank Company lost 2 Turbulent tractors to mine explosions. The engines and tracks of the remaining tractors were damaged or worn out. Despite the efforts of our repairmen, it became impossible to get spare parts. Although in search of them we scoured the territory of up to 100 kilometers in the rear areas of the army and the corps. Soldiers and officers became masters of the self-sufficiency part. In late August and early September, our company tried to put on the move and use the trophy trucks. From the huge amount of captured enemy combat vehicles abandoned by the retreating army, especially in the area of fighting near Kaniv, our troops were able to collect a significant number of usable vehicles. A company commander captured a fuel tanker full of fuel, greatly increasing our supply of black, or unaccounted for, fuel. The Russians had a large number of Ford heavy trucks, which were reliable in service, as well as ZIS trucks. These 2 types of trucks probably made up their entire arsenal, which the enemy had, and we always preferred the American-made Ford whenever possible, as many spare parts could be found if needed. By taking trophies and using them in this way, our army appeared to include vehicles of all types and varieties collected from half the territory of Europe. Sometimes it was impossible to find even the simplest spare parts. We were increasingly jealous of the uncomplicated supply system of the Russians. Although their arsenal of weapons and military equipment was not as varied and specialized as ours, what they did have was reliable and almost everywhere could be logistically serviced. As in any army, one of the biggest topics of discussion was the availability and quality of food. Our company field kitchen could work wonders as long as our supply was able to get us the essentials. During one of my visits to the field kitchen, the company cook proudly showed me a cave where hundreds of sausages and pieces of smoked meat hung on long rails. I gave the cook several Soviet trophy medals and pistols as gifts for the kitchen staff, and thereafter we were always guaranteed something more substantial than the standard rations. On September 25 and 26, The bulk of the division left the former combat area on the west bank of the Dnieper. Once again, long columns of grey, bending, marched southward over rough terrain. The enemy troops, who had stubbornly resisted us during the past weeks, seemed to have disappeared without a trace before our advance. During October, the division was advancing in the Ukraine, painted with the splendour of autumn. We were moving toward Kremenchug, which meant that the city of Odessa on the Black Sea had not yet been taken. There were rumours among the troops that we and the Romanian units were instructed to capture it. On October 17, we learned that Odessa had fallen. The division turned southeast and was ordered to march on Nikolaev. On the way, we crossed the area of ethnic German settlements, which were founded by decree of the Russian Empress Catherine the Great about 200 years ago. Here we easily recognized the places named after Karlsruhe, Worms, Speer, Gelenthorn, and other cities of our homeland. We met only women, children, and a few old men, as the Soviets deported all men of draft age, in a simple but clean and sturdy house. I saw the living part of it and a bedroom that could have been found somewhere in the Palatinate 200 years ago. There stood a wide wooden bed topped with a large canopy. On it lay colourful pillows. The peasant women spoke a dialect that can be heard in the Palatinate today. Helping ourselves to fresh milk and white bread, we felt quite at ease in such surroundings. A few days later, we crossed the Bug River on a swinging pontoon bridge, which could hardly withstand the current. I, together with the company commander and a few other men, had the opportunity to see unfinished warships of about 1,000 tons displacement standing in dry docks. We were given a new objective, Kherson, and the campaign continued. On October 25, we again crossed the mighty Dnieper, whose waters had absorbed our blood and sweat about 100 kilometers north of here. It was clear that the units of the Southern Army ahead of us had advanced to the Sea of Azov, and that we should join them and serve as reinforcements. Soon it appeared that we were approaching the western outskirts of a bleak, desolate area called the Nogai Steppe. After heavy fighting from October 26 to 28, the divisions of the 11th Army broke through the narrow Perekop corridor and thus opened the way for our advance into the Crimean Peninsula. As part of the reserve of the Wehrmacht High Command, the 132nd Infantry Division was attached to von Manstein's army. Only a limited contingent of troops could be employed to penetrate the narrow corridor. Anyway, it was now necessary to replenish the army for a further offensive to the peninsula and occupy it. Moving forward over the graves of the Tatars, the ancient defenders of the Crimea from the northern conquerors, we entered a new zone of fighting. Our division, together with the 15th Infantry Division, attached to the Liv Corps, was ordered to persistently pursue the enemy in the direction of the line Bakhchazara-Sevastopol. It was also necessary to simultaneously cut the road to Sevastopol. Forward units of motorized units concentrated for the attack. On October 31, the enemy found signs of widespread retreat. Forward units in long columns were moving quickly to the south, and the horse-drawn units were lagging behind. Their advance to the front was slower. In Kara-Naimuk, the horses of both the infantry and artillery regiments had to be fed from a single well. All other sources of water had been poisoned by the retreating Soviet troops. The huge number of piled-up wagons and cattle made it seem as if they were from some other time, as if an army of conquerors from another century was rushing across the steppe, sweeping away everything in its path. In the Crimea, we were haunted by a growing sense that we were becoming increasingly isolated from the Western world. We suffered severe water shortages, and the few deep wells and reservoirs that had not been poisoned by the retreating enemy contained brackish water, either unpleasant to taste or not suitable for drinking at all. Soldiers suffered unquenchable thirst, because they were working in excruciating heat, and the shortage of water for horses became so critical that even the strongest and healthiest animals had to be frequently replaced in sleds. The company field kitchen attempted to make coffee from brackish water, sweetening it with saccharine, but the result was a disgusting-tasting slop that could only be drunk with a tremendous effort of will. The duration of the daily march of infantry companies and horse-drawn units now ranged from 50 to 60 kilometers. Motorized reconnaissance units and armored units could move much faster and quickly reach the Alma Valley. From west to east, towards the Black Sea, the Crimean Peninsula is crossed by 3 zones of large valleys: Alma, Kacha, and Belbek. The northern part of the peninsula is a vast salt steppe. Here there were large deposits of induct. The waters of the Sivash easily evaporated, and the precious salt remained and lined the basins. In many other regions of Russia, salt is rare and difficult to extract. As we marched through the Ukraine, we noticed that salt was used as a medium of exchange by the local people, and it was more valued here than in our homeland. As we passed through villages, peasant women would present us with dishes of bread and salt as a sign of hospitality, indicating the high value placed on this expensive product. The central part of the Crimea is a flat plain with hardly any trees, but it is nevertheless fertile and well cultivated. Here, as everywhere else in the Soviet Empire, farms were put under collective management and collective farms were formed. During the winter months, snow and ice storms rage in the area, coming from eastern Ukraine. In the south are the Yala Mountains. They rise steeply from sea level to a height of 2,000 meters, abruptly fall off at the Black Sea on the southern coast. These mountains are densely forested, and the valleys stretching from south to north are covered with lush vegetation. Fruit plantations can be seen everywhere, as well as picturesque Tatar villages. Soon we reached a battlefield whose name would not give us peace for many months: Sevastopol. Over the next few days we laid siege to its northern and northeastern frontiers. During the first days of November we had little contact with the enemy. Nevertheless, artillery batteries continued to shell our unprotected western flank. On November 2, units of the 436th and 437th Infantry Regiments left the staging area located in the village of Kanishkoy and soon, in the early morning hours, met stubborn enemy resistance, despite the fact that the Russians pressed us from the left flank. We advanced in the direction of Adshi-Bulat and broke through the enemy's defences, thus opening the way for further offensive. With the coming of dusk, the powerful onslaught of the enemy on our left flank became obvious to us. The enemy units were suppressed only by heavy artillery fire. There was a rumour that because of the shortage of personnel, the artillery calculations of the enemy were replenished with volunteers from among the prisoners held in Russian camps. Throughout the night, Soviet Marine units did not stop trying to break through. But when desperate Soviet troops tried to break through our positions in the direction of Sevastopol and the coast, their attacks were crushed by our strong defences. To protect the exposed western flank and suppress the fire of an enemy coastal artillery battery located on the Black Sea coast that was impeding the division's advance, units of the 438th Infantry Regiment struck west and southwest. A small strike force later succeeded in reaching the false positions of this battery. Here they found wooden artillery barrels aimed skyward, looking threatening but helpless. The Russians had managed to conceal the true location of this heavy artillery battery, which was further south near Nikolaev. At nightfall, after a hard fight, we succeeded in capturing the positions of the coast artillery. We could see manoeuvres of an enemy ship on the Black Sea, and our rat opened fire on it. During the night, the enemy troops left the coastal battery, and the surviving naval units evacuated from the peninsula by boat, and then they were picked up by large Soviet ships cruising in the open sea. Lieutenant Deagle of I Battalion, 438th Infantry Regiment, along with 20 of his comrades, died a soldier's death during this operation. It became obvious to us that the Russians were in complete control of the Black Sea, as the silhouettes of Soviet warships were visible on the horizon, cruising unimpeded beyond the reach of our guns. The day before, during the battle, we had seen a huge number of enemy Air Force planes, but soon the fighter aviation cleared the sky of enemy aircraft. On November 3, mid-afternoon, forward units of my regiment, consisting of part of the 14th Motorized Anti-Tank Company and the 9th Bicycle Company, captured a small Tartar village southwest of Evil Sheikh. in which we found an abandoned clothing depot containing provisions for the Russian army, including many cases of cigarettes. We continued to advance along the valley of Kacha. In the rays of the setting sun, the landscape seemed marvelously beautiful. We could see a narrow road running along poplar plantations and between fruit plantations. From a distance of about 1.5 kilometers, we looked at the pretty little Tatar houses with wooden terraces and low roofs scattered across the valley and between the crests of the hills. As we approached the outskirts of the village, the unit ahead came under heavy enemy fire, and I immediately opened fire with my Atgm on the still unseen enemies in and between the houses. With fire support from our gun, the officer commanding the 9th Company began to move forward. On the wall of the house behind us, the enemy was taking small arms fire. Bullets left marks on the earth-coloured painted buildings near our gun position, leaving swirling clouds of dust. In this chaos, our company commander remained steadfast and steady on his feet, ignoring the shells hitting the wall behind him while we lay low or took cover behind the steel shield of the 80. Through the deafening rumble of machine guns, I heard the piercing scream of a wounded soldier, and someone began shouting, wounded in the abdomen. A nearby machine gun was firing almost continuously. The machine gunner was sending line after line at fast-moving targets. We were absorbed in loading the gun and firing at the distant figures prowling between the houses, while the machine gunner carried the fire as the enemy moved. We endeavoured to give the impression that the battle was being fought by the whole regiment, and not at all by a weak lead detachment consisting only of an infantry company and 2 anti-tank guns. The stratagem succeeded, and we saw a group of Soviet soldiers, dressed in tight-fitting dark blue navy overalls, retreating along the valley floor westward toward the sea. A wounded infantryman lay behind us, a few feet away, on the edge of the road. His upturned helmet was lying and a few feet away. A corpsman knelt beside him and unbuttoned his dusty tunic to dress his wound. After a few seconds, the soldier's cries for help lying in the dirt turned to unintelligible mumbling. His feverish eyes, standing out in a face white as chalk, seemed to grow wide with surprise. He stared ahead into the blackness, and the shadow of death quickly descended upon him. The orderly removed the watch from the lifeless hand of the soldier and hastily began to remove the personal effects of the deceased from the pockets of the tattered, blood-spattered uniform. We turned away and busied ourselves with our own thoughts and duties. The thoughts of those in the vicinity were purely personal, and no one could shake off the feeling of acute pity for our brother in the grey uniform, struck down by death. But in thinking about it, each of us, as it turned out, directed our thoughts to himself, to the fact that perhaps he would be the next to die, the next to find his grave in Russia. Such thoughts sometimes took possession of us, and we were helpless before them, as we were before the death that had carried our comrade away so quickly. Thus began the realization that this foreign land was exterminating us. People were embarrassed and tried to suppress these experiences. During the battle, these repressed emotions entangled every nerve and were strained to the breaking point by the fact that we were confronted again and again with something that caused us a sense of indescribable terror. The cure for our inner turmoil was for us only action, helping the wounded as much as we could, manipulating weapons and military equipment, firing at the enemy. The infantrymen were increasingly gripped by a sense of merciless rage, and the excited mind could concentrate only on avenging fallen comrades, exterminating the enemy, destroying. The highest degree of rage resembled suicidal moods, so close together were fear and courage. In the hours of calm, we sometimes talked about the impact on our lives of the loss and danger we encountered daily. Everyone agreed that ordinary people with strong natures often cope better, with less psychological stress, than those who are normally considered intellectuals or sensitive individuals. However, there are no rules to guide this kind of reasoning. They apply only to a specific situation that will never exactly repeat itself again. In war, all situations are different. A soldier's personality also changes over time as he gains experience. It is often said that people get used to it. A person can get used to danger or the constant presence of death. Nevertheless, during all the long years of the Russian campaign, the sight of severely wounded, agonizing soldiers and my powerlessness to help them always disturbed me far more than the instant and painless death of a comrade. He met death and was gone, and the cries of our wounded or wounded enemies lying on the neutral strip were often heard long after the guns had fallen silent. In the dim light of the early November morning, I was sitting on the gun carriage on sentry duty when suddenly, at a very close distance, I heard the crack of rifle shots and machine gun bursts, with bullets flying above and behind me. I jumped down from the gun carriage and, turning around, saw many Russians who, not more than 50 paces from my position, were running rapidly between the fruit trees. I was immediately pierced with an icy chill as I realized that our small unit had been cut off from the company. Collapsing to the ground between the stanchions, I nervously pulled the stock of my carbine up to my cheek, took aim at one of the dark silhouettes, and pulled the trigger. The light rifle made itself felt with the recoil of the shot, and the paralyzing fear immediately evaporated while I was inserting a new clip into the chamber of my carbine. Our machine gun crew, awakened by the rumble of gunfire, rushed to their machine gun and began frantically turning the barrel of the machine gun to the rear. In a few seconds he was already sweeping the undergrowth between the trees with a wide fan of longitudinal fire. My gun crew came out of cover and rushed toward my position at the gun, but we could not fire our guns without hurting our own soldiers with direct fire. The Russians succeeded in infiltrating between us and the Tartar houses where the 9th and 14th companies were stationed, and we saw our soldiers jumping out of the houses in the distance, excited by the increasing intensity of the firefight. The gunfire quickly spread between the fruit groves as the Soviets shifted devastating fire to our position and came under fire from our main force. When our troops poured more heavy fire on the enemy from both directions, the attacking enemy unit was virtually annihilated and the Soviet soldiers who survived the barrage of fire were taken prisoner. From interrogation of the prisoners, it became clear that the enemy unit was part of a group that had tried to break through our position to the shore the previous day. The prisoners were dressed in naval uniforms, apparently recently made and still immaculately clean. The prisoners claimed to be members of an elite Marine unit, and we were impressed by the sheer firepower that such a small group of warriors produced. All were armed with semi-automatic rifles or short-barreled assault rifles, with round magazines holding up to 72 rounds of ammunition. I took an automatic rifle and some round magazines for myself from one of the prisoners, as I no longer trusted the .98 carbine in close combat. I felt more confident with the more powerful assault rifle, and it stayed with me for many months. Between the ruined dwellings along the narrow road stretched an ancient stone wall bordered by vegetable gardens. We knocked stones out of it to make embrasures looking towards the enemy. Behind our position we made a barricade of stones to protect us from enemy mortar and artillery fire. We were lucky in our section, but behind us in the distance the bursts of high explosive shells continued to rumble. We tried our best to strengthen our firing position, but our occupation was again interrupted by an enemy counterattack. The Soviet Marines crept through the dense undergrowth among the trees at close range, and suddenly silent figures dressed in black and blue appeared before us like fleeting dawn shadows. Again the machine guns rumbled, accompanied by the barking of our mortars in the rear, followed seconds later by the thumping of the ground about 150 paces ahead of us. The enemy's advance halted, and the enemy again evaporated in the undergrowth, leaving behind them killed and wounded. While combing the area, we came across one unharmed Russian who had lost his way, lying behind a mangled stump 50 meters from our firing position. With shouts of "Stop," "Hands up," and "Come here," I ordered him to approach our position. He stumbled forward with his hands held high and a good-natured smile on his face. We removed from his belt 2 hand grenades, a full ammunition pouch, and the messenger took him to company headquarters. The incessant mortar fire poisoned our existence during the day. The rumble of explosions was constantly heard in our trenches. One day, studying the terrain in front of us through field binoculars, our company commander suddenly leaned back, throwing high up both torn hands. Blood was gushing from the open wounds and pouring through his sleeves. A razor-sharp mine splinter had cut through the glass and cleanly severed several fingers on both hands. The commander was not hit anywhere else, and his radio operator escorted him to a field hospital. On November 5, the divisions were ordered to take possession of the Bilbek Valley near Duvankoy, Gajkoy and Bayuko Tarkoy. The task was accomplished in the evening of the same day, and the attacks that followed over the next 2 days took the form of an arrow-shaped advance that captured a large section of the outer defences and field positions northeast of the fortress of Sevastopol, the Mackenzie Heights, the city itself, and the towering area designated as Hill, 363.5, were taken and held in heavy fighting. Late in the afternoon of November 7, the regiment received orders to mount guns on the line of defence of Mackenzie Heights. Shortly thereafter, one of the AT companies hit an enemy tank during a Soviet counterattack. Our tractor was thrown up on a bumpy road leading to the new destination, the western ridge of the Yala Mountains. The high plateau before us was covered with dense forests and undergrowth, and as seen from afar, the gently rising hills and shallow valleys from which we had just advanced were like a smooth green-brown carpet. The marvellous scenery of the fields surrounding Bakhaysarai opened before us. The jagged white limestone cliffs to the south were bathed in a light pink glow against the setting sun. The view was serene. But the war rumbled on with the shots of our batteries on the heights, and enemy shells in return suddenly burst on the Mackenzie Plateau. About 20 paces off the trail we came upon a massive concrete embrasure from which the barrel of a Soviet rapid-fire cannon protruded, its steel plate rising steeply into the evening sky. Just recently abandoned, it was clearly one of the guns that had brought us so much agony, firing at us for days from these dominant heights. The heavy artillery soon transferred its fire to these cliffs, and we had to seek shelter from the red-hot shell fragments in this abandoned bunker. This giant gun was similar in design to our 88mm anti-aircraft gun, although it was larger, and the heavy bed had technical information stamped on it in English, along with the caliber and year of manufacture, 1938. We assumed it must have been built for use as a British or American naval gun. A few seconds after we had dived into this bunker, Hartmann drew our attention to an ammunition truck that was slowly climbing up the steep slope behind us, and we prepared for its approach. Suddenly, 200 meters away from us, a 3-axle exploded, emitting frantic flames, and a sultan of black smoke spiraled into the sky. Ammunition, loaded to the top, began to detonate, raining hot shrapnel and surviving shells down on us. The vehicle, which must have taken a direct hit from a camouflaged cannon that punctured the unprotected fuel tank, continued to shower the area with sparks for several hours. After this eruption began to subside, we cautiously approached the vehicle. And finally, the flames subsided enough for us to pull the crumpled and burned body of the dead driver from the burning truck. Once again at sunset it began to rain. With streams of water dripping off the raincoats hanging from their tired shoulders, the gun crews began to dig and chisel a grave in the rocky ground for their dead effrater. A shallow grave was dug in silence, and everyone sank into their own thoughts, which are inevitably annoying when one loses a comrade. The soldiers clutched slippery sapper shovels. The shallow grave was prepared. The body was stripped of its personal badge, and the burned remains were left to rest tightly wrapped in a rubberized shroud. We poured earth on the grave and placed his worn and scratched helmet on top of the resulting mound. It was hard to imagine that his life's journey had come to an end, and only a steel helmet remained on a low mound of earth on the slope of a Crimean mountain. The rain was intensifying, washing the soil off the crumbling stones we had piled on his grave. In the darkness, the stones looked white as chalk, reflecting the light of the flares taking off and floating in the distance over Mackenzie. Cold rain poured down all night, dripping off the edges of our helmets and over our collars as we pushed the gun through the viscous clay to the firing position. As dawn glimmered on the horizon, we shared ersatz coffee with the sentry sitting behind the machine gun. He told us about the powerful Soviet counterattacks that had taken place in this sector the previous days. Then we dug into the ground again, digging deeper and laying rocks around our gun to protect it from shell fragments. Suddenly and silently, waves of enemy soldiers rushed out of the darkness. Against us was concentrated selected Soviet marine infantry, and its ranks were reinforced by working detachments called from the factories and docks of Sevastopol. They attacked us from the dense undergrowth in front of Mackenzie with hoarse cries of hurrah. Rushing to our guns, we turned from attackers into defenders and were ready to defend our positions as fiercely as the Russians had done a few days before on these same heights. We opened fire at point-blank range on the attackers with high-explosive shells. The rumble of battle drowned out the shouts of the Soviet soldiers. The frantic reloading of the guns concealed the terror that gripped our rank. Nearby, a heavy machine gun ran through the feed chute one after another, ribbons of shiny cartridges, ejecting shell casings from the hot receiver in an endless stream. In 50 meters in front of our trenches on the stony ground began to burst mines. It was standing behind us. Mortar calculations tried to weaken the waves of attackers piled on us. The advance slowed down in front of our trenches. The open space in front of us was dotted with the black silhouettes of the dead and dying. Through the ringing in our ears from the close firing of hundreds of barrels, we could only distinguish the screams of the wounded. The pre-dawn air remained heavy and almost suffocating with bitter gunpowder smoke, and through the smoke and dust one could hardly make out the outlines of the wounded enemy soldiers thrashing in agony in front of our positions. A few minutes later we were subjected to another attack, and the sun rising above the horizon exposed the full horror of the battlefield picture. Driven by hatred and bloodlust, fueled by a generous dose of vodka, the Russians staggered ahead of the commissars, waving their pistols threateningly. Their loud cries of hurrah, again lost in the deafening roar of exploding shells. Through this roar I heard a machine gunner shout, "I just can't kill all the time." He pressed the trigger relentlessly, sending streams of bullets from the smoking barrel of the MG into the masses of attackers. Our AT-GM shells were creating gaps in the ranks. This attack stopped some 50 meters from the barrel of our gun. We were positioned at a strategically important height close to Mackenzie, and the Red Army was quite aware that if they allowed our breakthrough to North Bay, their vital communications would be cut. Therefore, spurred on by threats, violence, and the patriotic appeals of the commissars, the Russians rushed upon us in repeated attacking waves. By noon we were barely conscious, moving in the dense powder smoke. Our ears were ringing, we were physically exhausted by the tension and horror of the battle. We could hardly move our legs, trying to clear our firing position. The machine gunners could no longer straighten the fingers of their right hands. The mortar crews could hardly lift their arms from exhaustion. The barrels of the machine guns, which changed rapidly in the brief pauses between attacks, lay on the ground. Empty ammunition boxes were scattered everywhere underfoot. A heavy silence fell upon our positions. The machine gunner and the loader collapsed on his machine gun in exhaustion, staring stupidly into the void. The AT calculation threw itself to the ground, still unable to fully comprehend the horror of the attack. Behind our positions we could faintly hear the clinking of sapper shovels, and the ringing in my ears gradually weakened. I remembered from history how in the Middle Ages the defenders of a fortress used to stack the dead in rows to provide cover in case of emergency. Now a comparison came to mind. In front of our positions densely lay dead and wounded Russians. The dense undergrowth that had covered them during the attack had been chopped and torn to pieces by thousands of bullets and shell fragments. With the departing sun, we welcomed the arrival of the darkness, defender. All night long we were kept awake by the groans of wounded Russians lying on no man's land. We fortified our positions and worked our asses off, hauling boxes of shells. There was no attempt on the part of the Soviets to remove their wounded either covertly or under the protection of the white flag. It was impossible to sleep. In front of our battalion sector, at the risk of drawing the fire of some sniper, a hasty count of the enemy dead was made, and long after that I heard in my sleep the words of a machine gunner, "I just can't kill anymore." Miraculously, No one was killed in my formation, although the battalion suffered numerous casualties. The Soviet attacking waves managed to break through a section of our defences before they were driven back in hand-to-hand combat. That evening, as we were transporting ammunition and food from the rear, we found ourselves near a field medical station along the way, and then, as the groans of our own wounded rang in our ears, we stumbled in their direction. Through the darkness we moved behind a pair of stretcher-bearers who were skirting shell craters filled with muddy water. We passed rows of our dead, wrapped in cloak tents, awaiting their final journey to the rear on mule-drawn carts. That night, however, they had to wait for their last march with the German army, as the wounded were being transported first. We saw a young army surgeon bent over a motionless figure, working ceaselessly with the aid of orderlies, with his sleeves rolled up in the dim light of a field lamp. Like cloak tents, weighed down by the rain, were spread over pits full of wounded men, and in the yellow light of the hissing lamp they were being injected with morphine and anti-tetanus serum. Balloons in the lungs were tightly bandaged, arteries were clamped with staples, limbs were bandaged and joints were set. Our wounded were laid in rows on piles of straw. Evacuation tags were attached to their uniforms, in dirty, torn uniforms, bandaged with blood-soaked bandages. They filled the atmosphere with a confusing mishmash of shrieks, groans, whimpers, and stony silence as they awaited their journey to an unknown destination. They were taken to the rear in small groups on wagons. A severe wound acts shockingly on a soldier, no matter how strong and brave he is, and he quickly becomes traumatized by what has come upon him. Our only thought was to escape from this nightmare, to leave this place of filth, suffering and death away where no shells were falling. We hurried forward and returned to the familiar soothing atmosphere at our gun, leaving this suffering behind us. The second half of November 1941, the nights were frosty. Fortunately, Crimea does not have the brutal Russian winter, and we did not experience the prolonged suffering from temperatures below zero that our comrades in the northern sections of the front had to endure. In the northern and central parts of the Crimean Peninsula, the winter is mostly similar to what we have in Germany, with frost and snow, but on the southern coast, on the Russian Riviera, the weather remains comparatively mild. The days and nights we spent made us realize that the winter uniforms issued under the German Infantry Division Service regulations were too light, especially for soldiers on the front lines. In frontline conditions, we were forced to live in open trenches or behind stone walls, and the roof over our heads consisted of lightweight tarpaulin cloak tents. In these primitive shelters, we were open to the elements, and it got even worse with the onset of frost and rain. The rear units, including intendants and auxiliary personnel, usually took advantage of the opportunity to find warm quarters and set up in available Russian houses, even though large-caliber naval guns from Soviet ships and from the fortress could cover these targets far behind us. Enemy fighters and Martin bombers daily attacked our battery locations, camp hospitals, supply columns, command posts, and other targets. To this load was added the season of impenetrable mud. When it got warmer, the trails and roads turned into bottomless drowns. Heavy trucks literally stood up, and again the transportation of materials to the front line was dependent on tireless Ukrainian donkeys pulling primitive carts. We in the forward units had already hardened ourselves, having endured constant deprivation and physical exhaustion all the previous months. Battles, transitions, life in the open air, and frequent suffering from thirst and cold made the soldiers strong and hardy, without a single gram of extra fat on their ribs. From the enemy we learned the art of improvisation and self-sufficiency. On cold nights we insulated our dugouts and stone shelters with blue overcoats, which we stole from enemy corpses lying in front of our positions. The dead of the Soviet army also provided us with thick brown flannel gloves. From somewhere in the rear we received an instruction that army socks could be used as gloves at night temperatures below zero. The recommendation, clearly stated in clear military language, said that soldiers on the front line should cut 2 holes in the sock for the thumb and forefinger. Someone probably didn't realize that our boots were about to be discarded, and the socks were nearly rags and had so many holes in them that we had no trouble finding holes for all 5 toes. As the mud came down on us with the cold weather, the front line stiffened and stabilized. The enemy was ceaselessly trying to recapture Mackenzie and the southern heights, as well as Duvanquoy. Our own troops remained too weak to seize the threatened seaside fortress in a surprise attack, and the situation was increasingly complicated by our lack of tanks and artillery. The garrison of the Soviet fortress was able to buy enough time to consolidate its position and make the defense strong. With the Soviet fleet having absolute dominance of the Black Sea, the fortress was able to easily receive supplies and reinforcements from the Taman Peninsula and the Caucasus. Our own supply arteries stretched an inconceivable distance across the continent from the Crimea to Germany. Mechanical breakdowns of the very unreliable German locomotives were already a proverb in winter conditions as they crossed the Ukraine in severe frosts. When warming temperatures arrived, motorized columns were drowned in mire on the soft, unpaved roads of southern Ukraine and northern Crimea. Roads on clay soil became virtually impassable to mechanized formations as they tried to make their way in the softened, rain-soaked ground. The very issue of supplies became a critical problem for the entire 11th Army. Because of the deteriorating supply situation, heavy shells had to be used very sparingly. The daily rations became increasingly monotonous and consisted mainly of barley soup mixed with a strange concoction of dried vegetables, which the infantrymen contemptuously called wire fence, supplemented by army ration cheese squeezed from tubes. Shortly before we were replaced on the front line at Mackenzie by the 24th Saxon Infantry Division, we were again harassed by the Bolshevik propaganda machine. We had long since become familiar with the leaflets that urged us to desert, tons of which had been dropped on us during the forcing of the Dnieper an eternity before. The nights were often filled with the screeching of loudspeakers spewing endless political speeches and clumsy attempts to persuade us to go over to the enemy sea. German soldiers and workers, throw off the yoke of the imperialists and fascist clique that oppress you. Come over to us, to the state of the collective farmers and workers. Clean, comfortable beds, beautiful women, good food, and pleasant wine await you, and you will be guaranteed life. This was followed by the International, to which we usually answered with angry machine gun bursts. With monotonous regularity, this routine was resumed every morning. A short time after the withdrawal from the front line, we learned that a section of the sector our unit held had fallen into Russian hands. We realized that this retreat might well have taken place while we were in that position. Nevertheless, our infantrymen dubbed those who replaced us the Tango Division. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. The relations between the 2 infantry divisions became so strained by these words that one of our Oberleutnants, an officer from Saxony, nearly fought a duel, which had been forbidden in Germany for some years. This incident could only be prevented by the timely intervention of our commander. In November 1941, the company rear was located near Bakhchisarai in some village on the main road leading to Simferopol. It consisted of a street paved with real cobblestones, along which rumbled convoys with cargoes, rolling to the Sevastopol. Up to the village stretched open terrain, on which motorized vehicles travelled only at full speed, rumbling carts pulled by mules, which galloped. The phrase "in full view of enemy forces" was known to every driver, and they were fully aware of the danger of this stretch of road, even without signs warning personnel of the danger. It could be confidently expected that passing vehicles would attract the attention of enemy artillery, firing from a long distance from the northern sector of the fortress of Sevastopol. Heavy 305mm shells sent from the armoured towers of the fort, called Maxim Gorky I, left impressive craters on the road. Most of my fellow countrymen first heard the name of the great Russian poet when they inquired about the source of those screeching, howling shells that regularly shook the patch of ground in front of our position. I never knew whether the Soviets themselves had named these huge guns after the poet, or whether it was simply one of the battle nicknames that quickly spread among the soldiers whose lives became miserable in his presence. Bakhchisarai lay to the east of this road, skillfully placed in a picturesque valley. It was the old capital of the Crimean Tatars, And here was the Khan's palace with its slender minarets and wooden arches decorated with rich carvings. Bakshi Saray is famous for its fountains, which, although dilapidated, have not lost their oriental pre-Soviet splendor. In the city bazaar, we met traders exchanging and selling goods that are considered trash in our country. When word reached us that we would soon be taken off the front line, we quickly sent our drivers to find suitable lodging in the rest area. They found a small Tatar house with a small veranda tastefully decorated with wood carvings. There were 2 living rooms, sparsely furnished. Along the walls were low benches on which to sit and sleep. We were given a large copper vat for bathing, a luxury we had long forgotten. 2 bent, wrinkled Tatar women went to work preparing hot water for us. In spite of our protests, they insisted that we shed our skinny bodies from our worn uniforms, which were crusted with mud, and then began to scrape the layers of mud off our bodies. We finally submitted to this cleansing with relaxed smiles, and then shaved the stubble off our chins. We quickly developed friendly relations with the inhabitants of this house and exchanged bread and saccharine for tobacco and fresh vegetables. They made it clear to us that the Tatar people had never been a friend of the Soviets and that they deeply resented the Russification of Crimea, which had made them a minority with an unenviable social position. There were several women and children in the house and an old man who rarely spoke. Probably all the young men had been drafted into the Soviet army during its withdrawal. An old woman of indeterminate age, looking like a mummy, sat on the bench all the time with a pipe in her toothless mouth. The only time I saw her round face touched with a smile was just before Christmas, when a baby was born. Then the old woman came to life and began waddling back and forth, tending to the young mother and the newborn. A few days before, the pregnant woman had been carefully brought into the house, and now we knew the birth of the infant by its first cries in the next room. Afterward, one of our medics gave them clean bandages, and we gave the young mother some candy. In this way, the soldiers and Russian women celebrated the birth of a new life, while a few kilometers away the destructive mechanism of modern warfare was in full force, and the rumble of explosions echoed through this gentle terrain. All day long we were greeted by the shouts of the Muslim Imam, and 5 times a day his singing voice was heard from the minaret of the mosque, calling the followers of Islam to prayer from sunrise to sunset. While bringing supplies to us during the fighting for Mackenzie, 2 of our rear men from the supply column managed to cross the steep, guerrilla-infested Yaila Mountains and reach the coastal road near Yalta. With the instinct of hungry jackals, they immediately found a Russian food warehouse. Next to barrels of sauerkraut and applesauce was a huge wine storehouse. It was sealed and put under the guard of Romanian soldiers, under the command of a stern German officer in ten. 2 of our soldiers begged permission to take something from the storehouse, but their requests and pathetic stories of hunger, cold and thirst on the front line did not soften the heart of the officer-intendant. Then the 2 men decided to play on the sympathy of the Romanians, and with a field light and cigarettes found a guard who went to meet them, and at night helped them to load some kegs on a car. The company field farewell intendants surprised us. 3 large wooden kegs of Crimean wine arrived on the very top of the back of his truck. When we heard that we could taste the wine from the kegs, we drank the priceless dark red liquid from tins taken from the canteen and field flasks, while humming the mills of the Black Forest Valley. To our repertoire were later added a few obscene songs that soldiers had been singing since the creation of the world, and eventually we emptied our wrinkled vessels. The drivers had devised a clever system for transporting the wine, using a piece of fuel hose that extended from the kegs through an open window right to our lodgings, where it arrived unnoticed by our company spies. And we drank sweet Crimean wine all night without interference in the best traditions of Peter the Great and Empress Catherine. The next day in the company office was prepared a reward document for combat merits, and in the justification of the award was written and confirmed, for receiving an important military material wine, our wounded company commander returned, strict but objective. He always commanded the company with exemplary fairness, never demanding from the soldiers what he could not or would not do himself. In the field hospital in Bekhi Sarai, He had his mangled hands amputated and several damaged fingers were healed. With bandaged hands, he walked around the company barracks, greeted the soldiers and inquired about their problems. Despite wounds that would have given him leave to recover, he stayed at the front with his company. Corpsman Aloy helped him wash and shave. Weapons and equipment were thoroughly inspected. Drivers regularly checked the condition of their vehicles to be sure that the engines would start immediately, even in below freezing temperatures. We realized that our days of resting in relative comfort were numbered and could not rid ourselves of the thought that the rigors of war would soon resume. In the Mosque of the Khan's Palace in Bakhchisarai, the divisional chaplains of both denominations served a pre-Christmas service. According to company regulations and in strict accordance with National Socialist political doctrine, attendance at religious events was voluntary, but almost the entire unit went to the mosque. Prudence, strength and faith remained slogans, key words throughout the days of the Christmas fast. We needed peace, and the initial excitement of war receded into the background, overpowered by a longing for a return to normalcy. We tried to find comfort in the words of the priests and chaplains in grey, but our thoughts focused on home, the wounded and the dead. After what we had recently witnessed, barely surviving, the political philosophy and idealistic rhetoric that had brought us to this foreign land on a wave of enthusiasm had become meaningless shards. The prospect of the first assault on Sevastopol loomed before us. Together with the 22nd Lower Saxon Infantry Division, we had to attack the northern flank of the enemy defence. We had to overcome a complex system of fortifications, engineering structures and steep slopes of the northern sector of the Sevastopol stronghold, and make our way to the northern bay. Knowing perfectly well that the northern sector concentrated the most powerful defences, we were advised to be ready to take the bull by the horns. After this blow, the enemy will lose access to the harbour exit and thus any hope of evacuation by sea. For this assault, the Army Command attracted all available forces. Only in the Kerch area was left one German division that did not take part in the offensive. Its task was the Coast Guard. It replaced a poorly armed Romanian division of questionable reliability. Supply problems affected the manning of our heavy artillery, with barely enough ammunition for a sustained battle. We were also desperately short of armoured troops. But the few we had faced enormous problems crossing difficult terrain, pushing their way through a network of fortifications defended by steadfast warriors. The Soviets created a system of fortifications of all kinds and kept control of the entire battlefield. Defended by a large force, the northern sector of the coastal fortress behind the hills, overlooking the Belbeg Valley, covered a vast area to the east of our positions. Rain drizzled all night, but as the sun rose the sky cleared. At 5.0 began the assault on the fortress along the entire Sevastopol front. The division moved forward with the main forces just behind the shaft of artillery fire and smoke screen. The heights west of the area, called Height 319.9, the target of the first wave of attack, were taken because of the deep echelon of enemy defensive positions. Further areas were taken slowly after suppressing stubborn resistance in individual pockets. Despite excellent viewing conditions from the batteries, the attacking soldiers could see few enemy positions until they were in deadly proximity to the defenders. To the infantry's delight, darkness fell early, forcing the assault teams to halt for the night after accomplishing their first task. On December 18, the enemy continued to resist stubbornly in positions along the lines from 217 to 253 and further south. Manstein's 11th Army continued to close in on the enemy, throwing divisions into the attack in the northern sector of the fortress at first light of day. At about 16, the enemy was dislodged from his defensive positions and driven back through the gorges and ravines south of Kaimishla toward the heights along lines 226, 228. By 15.0, almost all objectives had been achieved and further advance was halted due to darkness. In the pre-dawn hours of September 19, the 132nd Infantry Division moved forward, with the intention of breaking through the enemy defences and seizing the heights northeast of Chernaya and securing access to the northern bay. Further offensive unfolded very slowly because of the resistance, which became increasingly stubborn. The constant counterattacks of desperate marine units were successfully repulsed, and our advance was slowed by the fire of previously undetected mortar batteries and long-range naval guns, which bombarded our positions with heavy barrage fire. The objectives set for that day were finally taken in the early morning of December 20. In the division's right sector, the 436th Infantry Regiment took the town of Kamishli, and after heavy fighting, the 438th Infantry Regiment captured Hill 251. The divisions on our left were still hampered by dense undergrowth and almost impassable terrain. Our division, together with the 22nd Infantry Division, was able to penetrate deeply into the fortress defences. The assault units remained aimed in the direction of North Bay. The enemy, aware of our attempts to seize the approaches to the harbour, threw more and more units to defend the lines in our path. Our lead units came under a hail of attacks by bombers and fighters, suffering heavy losses. It was Christmas Eve 1941. Even at this most holy time, according to the soldiers of both warring parties, the inexorable god of war did not arrange a holiday break. We settled down in the craters and trenches dug on the former Russian defence line. From a warehouse in the rear, trucks with provisions delivered to each soldier a special ration consisting of a flask of Crimean wine and a loaf of white bread. They also brought the mail for the first time in many days. By the light of the Hindenburg candle, huddled under my faded and weathered cloak tent, my fingers stiff and aching from the cold, I opened the parcel from home. It was small, for the weight allowed was 2 kilograms. As I hastily tore open the crumpled wrapping and the sweet smell of gingerbread spread around me, contrasting sharply with the pungent odour of unworn woolen uniforms, heavy leather gear, and gun oil, I felt homesick. I had been sent a small candle on a star-shaped tinfoil holder, a piece of evergreen coniferous branch from our Black Forest, a small bottle of Black Forest cherry liqueur, and gingerbread baked by my mother and packed with the greatest care for the long journey east. The frost silvered the damp wall of the shelter, and as we breathed we emitted puffs of vapour that hung in the still air for a moment before dissolving into darkness, tightly pressed against each other. Wolf and I curled up in the damp cave carved into the Crimean soil and held our hands close to the inviting warmth of the Christmas candle. We were no longer disturbed by the crackling of Russian Maximovs somewhere in the distance, and we had stopped paying attention to the gunshots crackling overhead. Our gazes from under the rims of our steel helmets, battered and worn from months of constant use, were now fixed on the candle flame. Wolf's fluffy cheeks betrayed his youth, but it was clear from his eyes that this young man had grown up before his time. We had grown up together, and there was a sense of brotherhood between us, a closeness of spirit and trust that cannot be understood by those who have spent their entire lives in safety. Wolf pulled a harmonica from his pocket and played softly the traditional songs of his homeland. "O Christmas tree and silent night, holy..." 2 soldiers from a neighbouring trench, hearing the harmonica, crawled across the frozen ground to our position. Tucking our knees, we huddled closely together in the shelter, our bodies radiating a faint but much-needed warmth to each other. The camaraderie that existed between us, the realization that each of us was anxious to leave this place forever, mitigated the homesickness we felt in these hours. The contents of the Christmas parcels were equally divided. The wine from the flasks brought warmth to our clenched limbs. Wolf again played songs on the harmonica, and in husky voices we sang softly to the beat of the music. Outside, beyond the beams of our candle, a rocket hissed into the sky, producing eerie shadows on the ground as it floated slowly over the frozen ground. Next door, a Russian machine gun broke the silence, and immediately a sniper rifle shot rang out in response just ahead of our position. Again silence quickly descended on the lines, though there was no calm on the ground. After midnight, the gun crews, led by platoon commanders, gathered in the anti-tank ditch, which had been captured yesterday by our infantry battalion. With picks and trowels we set to work, widening the ditch, no longer feeling the cold as we broke through the frost-covered soil. Suddenly the sky lit up. About 200 meters away, the Russians sent up a rocket. We sprawled on the ground and lay motionless until the rocket, which seemed to take forever to slowly descend to the ground, was extinguished with a furious hiss. We, covered with sweat, crawled into the sun, making our way to our position. The morning horizon had already turned bright when the last heavy boxes of shells were in firing position. We rested leaning against the wall of the trench, wrapped up in raincoats, heavy with frost, and waited in silence for the order to post the guard. In the gaining light of Christmas Day, we scouted our site and found a dugout near an anti-tank ditch. The dugout was a good one, built of strong logs and deeply buried in the ground. The enemy, well aware of the location of this object, which had been left only a few hours before, soon brought fire down on it. Again we found ourselves under artillery fire, and as we had been under countless previous bombardments, resigned ourselves to the necessity of patiently enduring the hail of shells falling upon us. In a corner of the dugout, we found a small stove heated with wood, and we were baking bread until the exploding shells of the 152mm gun began to creep closer to our position, shaking the ground and throwing fountains of dirt and debris into the sky. With each explosion, earth fell from the beams and sand rained down on our shoulders and helmets. Instinctively, we moved to a far corner and pressed ourselves against the wall. Shell fragments and stone debris tore through the cloak tent hanging at the entrance and flew into the dugout. The artillery fire suddenly stopped. We thought that the shower of shells had stopped, but suddenly there was a terrible rumble. Suddenly a huge shell exploded over the dugout and threw us to the ground, from which we were dazed and almost lost consciousness. With difficulty we rose to our feet, gasping for breath from the powder smoke and vainly trying to get through the thick smoke, because of the ringing in our ears, unable to hear the cries of our wounded. At last the blinding dust and smoke cleared enough to reveal a huge hole in the ceiling, through which the cold grey light of a December day penetrated. 3 thick logs had been torn out like matchsticks by a huge shell, and tons of earth, which had hitherto rested on these logs, now lay in a heap before us. We began feverishly raking this mountain of dirt with our bare hands, digging up the dense clay in an attempt to free our comrades. With hands wounded by rocks and splinters, we pulled 2 wounded soldiers out from under the rubble. Burr was unconscious, with blood running down his face, and the other had wounds in both legs. He could not walk, and we suspected he had broken bones. He was talkative and holding up well despite the intense pain. A few minutes after Burr regained consciousness, we bandaged his wounds. Of the 6 in the dugout, only 2 were seriously wounded. Most of us had escaped injury, perhaps even death, because we were deep inside the bunker and were saved by the strong supporting wall when the shell struck right in the center of the structure. As we surveyed the damage, we were acutely aware of the fate that would have awaited us if we had been directly under the impact of the shell, where the splintered logs and tons of earth now rested. The chimney and stove were completely destroyed, and the cold began to penetrate through the splintered ceiling. We put Boer on a stretcher to carry him to the medical station. Shells continued to burst nearby, and a Russian anti-aircraft battery, located on the railroad line, began aiming at our position for direct fire. Understandably, under such conditions, the second wounded soldier refused to leave the area, preferring to wait until evening to be evacuated on a food ration delivery truck. I reluctantly allowed him to remain with us until it was possible to evacuate him in relative safety. By the end of the day, the shelling increasing turned into an even, continuous shaft of fire, and our position came under small arms and howitzer fire. The evacuation of the wounded soldier had to be postponed until the next morning. A few days later, we learned that he died in the hospital from complications due to developing gangrene. Given the nature of his injuries, I believe death could have been avoided if he had received immediate medical attention. Subsequently, I endeavored to give the wounded man medical attention as quickly as possible, without yielding to his personal wishes, which are usually expressed under the influence of terrible pain. On the night of December 26, my gun crew crossed the anti-tank ditch and moved forward. At the bottom of the trench we found several of our dead comrades and passed them, averting our eyes. The casualty count was enormous, and we tried to concentrate on other things, on what fate would have in store for us in a few minutes or hours. We were lying in front of a railroad embankment that ran toward the Mackenzie Heights. In spite of intense enemy small arms fire, 2 men were fencing and camouflaging the guns by covering them with grass and branches along the edges of each attack. For 2 days we had not had hot food delivered, and Wolf and I volunteered to work as ration carriers. Shortly before dusk we crept to the rear by our tracks coming from the ditch and climbed to an elevated position from which we could observe the enemy. Behind us, machine gun bursts were heard as we made our way across no man's land, running from one cover to another. Finally, we found ourselves in the safety of a small grove. As we ran toward the thicket, an anti-aircraft gun from the railroad mowed the treetops above us, and we instinctively ducked as splinters and branches fell to the ground beside us. Our hearts were pounding with exertion when we finally reached our former dugout and found the supply drivers, who issued us thermoses of food that had been warm since the previous day. While we were hauling rations, several IL-2 attack planes appeared on the horizon, and we watched as they attacked the forward positions. They flew low and fast, dropping 50-kilogram fragmentation bombs right on our company's position, then made a turn and came back to attack with onboard guns and machine guns. In between air raids, we were sneaking forward in the thickening dusk with thermoses behind our backs. And when we finally reached our positions, the platoon commander, Oberfeldwebel Weiss, before jumping to his feet, looked at us for a few seconds with amazement. 2 infantrymen had arrived at our position just after we left, and a shrapnel bomb had hit them right in their hastily dug trench. They died instantly, and the platoon commander ignorantly reported that Wolf and I were killed in action. The soldiers of the platoon silently celebrated our rising from the dead by greedily devouring the hot food. We tried not to think about the deaths of our 2 countrymen. We had suffered too many casualties to worry about what could not be avoided. The infantry companies had been reduced from 80 to 20 men. Despite these losses, the companies were continuously thrown into action on the fortifications surrounding Sevastopol. They managed to break through the defensive lines and in fierce fighting to capture numerous strongholds, fighting for months for survival. Each infantryman demonstrated remarkable endurance when they had to live in the open in the harshest conditions with only field rations to sustain life. My Ati platoon now numbered only 2 guns, which were normally manned by a 4-man squad for each gun. With 2 more soldiers, Wolf and I began training another squad. On the evening of December 27, the infantry regiments were preparing for a new offensive. Part of the 501st Infantry Division was assigned to reinforce the left sector. December 28 at 7:00 our troops rushed to the assault. The attack was preceded by a massive artillery bombardment. Mortars fired many Nebelwerfer shells towards the enemy, which whizzed over us with a shrill screech, leaving behind blue-white tails before exploding on the enemy positions. The prisoners confirmed that the Soviet soldiers were very afraid of these rockets, which they nicknamed mooing cows. We, on the other hand, called the high-speed Russian Katyusha Stalin's organ. We crouched down in our trenches, preparing to rush at the enemy. Minutes slowly flowed. The soldiers were smoking nervously in silence. Thoughts of the coming offensive, wives and children, mothers and fathers, the cold corpses of comrades we had seen the previous night flashed through our brains. In vain we tried to concentrate on the present moment. The machine gunners checked the operation of their weapons once more and cleaned the feed chutes, making sure the gleaming machine gun belts were free of dirt and sand that might jam the weapons' locking mechanisms. Hand grenades were inserted into leather belts and boot shanks. The sergeant silently crossed himself in prayer. The others pretended not to notice. As the decisive moment approached, the squad leaders tried to inspire the soldiers, trying to convince them that their battle-worn and weakened company, we can do the impossible. The rampart of fire crept forward, and the attacking chains silently rushed to the same place. After a heavy battle, the Mackenzie of Mountains were taken. The number of soldiers in the company was less than ever. We set up our gun near the railroad station of Mackenzie Vigori, where next to a stone wall there was a shelter for us from the incessant artillery shells that fell indiscriminately on our section. We spent the night curled up under a Russian tank that had been hit. By morning the snowfall had covered the tortured ground with a white blanket, as if trying to hide the wounds of war. Only a few ugly black spots gave away the places of fresh craters. The full moon illuminated the surroundings as if covered with silver glaze. Before dawn, Wolf and I requisitioned a white sheet from an abandoned house, with which we disguised the armoured gun shield of the ATP. In the grey light of the morning of December 29, we took shelter in a small stone house with thick natural stone walls, through which peered broken window frames. Later we learned that it used to be the dwelling of the station chief of Mackenzie Epigori. It was cold, and we melted the stove with fragments of furniture. Wolf found somewhere a small sack of potatoes, which we cut up to fry on the stove. The aroma of potatoes filled this primitive area, and a thin cloud of smoke rose from our dwelling into the calm, milky-coloured morning sky. The enemy had kept up a heavy but indiscriminate fire on the station area all morning, and the black circles of earth left by the bursting shells stood out in sharp contrast on the pure white snow. A mine had exploded near the corner of a house, but had done only minor damage to the building. We stretched out tiredly on the floor, enjoying the luxury of the heated room. After satisfying our hunger with hot potatoes and onions, we rolled cigarettes from the brown-golden leaves of Crimean tobacco that softened on the steaming, wrinkled copper samovar. We also cut tobacco for pipes and got into a debate over the best methods of processing tobacco for maximum flavour. One argued that it was best soaked in fig juice. The other argued with conviction that corn vodka was best, although we had neither. Wishing to put an end to this silly argument, Conrad advised the use of horse urine, which our army had in abundance. As the sun rose above the horizon, the density of artillery fire increased, reaching a crescendo as the god of war began to smash our positions. The shells, blasting upward geysers of earth, sought out their next victims. Our sentry had taken shelter near a low stone wall, and a nearby shell burst covered him with dirt and debris. We found him lying flat on the ground with his hands covering his head and his body and legs bruised with blood. We dragged him to our shelter, diving down and throwing ourselves flat on the ground at every burst of shell. I took over sentry duty, keeping watch through the frame of the broken window. In the sky hung the black-grey plumes of bursting artillery shells, and before the shelling ceased I noticed several new mushroom-like clouds rising up in our section. About 100 meters away, 2 houses were burning brightly in the frosty morning air. From my position, I saw 2 soldiers with rifles at the ready, skirting the funnels, run across the village street. 2 red rockets hissed into the sky, warning us that we were ready to repel any attack. The enemy artillery fire resumed, moving forward in waves, and it seemed that most of the shells were falling some 100 meters from our position. As our platoon jumped out of the house on alert to take their places in the firing position, I heard the sharp boom of a tank gun, mingled with the frantic boom of rifle shots and machine gun bursts. We rushed to our anti-tank gun, which was 20 paces from where the railroad crossed the dirt road. Crouching near the gun, I turned it in the direction from which I had heard the rumble of the tank and looked out from behind the gun shield to inspect the sector of fire without interference. And the Italian messenger rushed past, shouting desperately. Tank! Tank! Peering out from behind the steel shield protecting the gun crew, I saw the dark outline of a turret moving slowly between the houses. With my right eye pressed against the rubber ring of the optic, I tried to keep my eyes on the heavy machine partially hidden in a side street. With my heart pounding, I quickly turned the barrel to where I had last seen the enemy tank. Distance, 150 meters. My heart was almost jumping out of my chest, but I tried to wait calmly until the tank again appeared in my field of vision. And here the steel colossus is already moving threateningly in the sight with a powerful armoured turret turned in our direction. With trembling hand I pressed the firing button. The gun bounced back slightly, and through the sight I could trace the trajectory of the 37mm shell. I looked in horror at the white smoke that rose into the sky as the shell hit the turret. A ricochet? Hey, the tank is 40 meters away. I shouted, not taking my eyes off the optics. Our loader Conrad had already opened a box of armor-piercing shells for the powerful armor. With lightning speed, Wolf drove the heavy, red-tipped shell into the gun and slammed the breech door shut. Before I could even press the firing button again, I felt the cold air and the shock wave on my cheek as the heavy shell whizzed past us and crashed directly behind us into the flaming truck, scattering chunks of metal all over the area. Again, keeping the crosshairs firmly on the center of the tank's eye, I pressed the firing button. My ears were ringing from the gunfire, and we were unable to hear the shell burst on target. Wolf and Conrad were already loading a new shell when I noticed a thin cloud of smoke rising from the turret, followed seconds later by a blinding flash. A huge black mushroom-shaped cloud rose into the frosty bright blue sky. A powerful explosion tore the turret off its rails as the ammunition inside the tank began to detonate. It slid off its chassis, and its long cannon clumsily propped up toward the sky. A machine gun burst ripped through the fresh snow directly in front of us. Through the ringing in our ears, we heard someone yell, "Tank on the right." 4 soldiers grabbed hold of the gun carriage and, with a strain, sliding on the frozen ground, turned the gun barrel in the other direction. I discerned a second tank slowly turning among the village huts, and it was slowly coming out in a straight line to pick up speed. Blowing puffs of smoke from its exhaust pipes, it accelerated in our direction, breaking through the wooden fences between garden plots about 80 meters away. The heavy tank, tumbling from side to side, came to a halt, and its turret began to turn in search of our position. I hastily tried to find the target. Suddenly I saw in the crosshairs of the gun optics the round black muzzle of the enemy's gun. Just as I had destroyed the first tank, now the enemy gunner was aiming his gun at us. Feverishly entering drift and distance corrections, I was a fraction of a second faster. Now only a moment was to decide whether we would live to see the evening or be buried in an unknown grave on a forgotten battlefield. Our first shell thundered into the heavy turret, and we saw the crew fall outside from the smoke-filled tank. Tank on the right. Again we deployed the and behind the burning remains of the first tank we discerned the vague silhouette of a third. The massive machine, bursting through the smoke, was rumbling toward us, and behind it ran several Russian infantrymen with rifles drawn, shouting hurrah loudly. They quickly occupied the farthest chain of houses in the Mackenzie Mountains. After a shell hit the hull of the tank, where there was thick armor, it stopped smoothly, and the turret began to turn slowly in our direction. We sent another armor-piercing shell into the tank, and it was immediately engulfed in flames. While we were shelling the infantry ranks with fragmentation shells, Wolf and Conrad were reloading the cannon with devilish speed. A lone machine gun joined us in the defense of our position, and the attack was repulsed. At a great distance I spotted the 4th and 5th tanks. We opened fire on them, and the fleeting shadows of the turrets disappeared behind the crest of the hills. The infantry retreated to find themselves under the barrage of our mortar crews and artillery batteries. At the we threw our hands up to the sky and shouted something unintelligible to each other in an uncontrollable outburst. We were beyond relieved to have escaped almost certain death. After a few long minutes of jubilation, I began to mentally reconstruct the splendid coherence displayed by the soldiers of my calculation. Every movement, every action, and every word was deliberate and effective. The endless training and gun drills, the cursing, complaining, and sweat expended in the previous months had saved our lives that day. Our artillery batteries now opened fire, sending countless shells that rained down upon the fleeing enemy. To reinforce our sector, Pell and his squad dragged his HEM over the railroad embankment. A lone self-propelled gun rumbled past us in the direction of the Soviets. Its crew was not visible behind the armor, and at that moment our fight stopped. In past months, the repulsion of an attack was usually followed by an immediate pursuit of the enemy in a counterattack by fresh, fully manned German units. Fresh troops were able to penetrate deeply into the Sevastopol defense line, seize the armored pillbox 626, later referred to in reports as Stalin. This strike led to a breakthrough to the bay, which split the Soviet forces. Under the existing conditions, we had only battle-weakened companies with insufficient reserves to launch an additional strike. The companies of our infantry regiments were too depleted from months of continuous fighting to accomplish such a task. The 9th Company of our regiment now numbered only 18 men. The duties of company commander were performed by a field sergeant. For weeks the soldiers knew no respite, repelling Russian attacks and then attacking again. Stress and battle losses were aggravated by the climate, damp, cold days and frosty nights. In the trenches, under the cover of tattered trench coats, pocket stoves, which could be used to heat food preserved in cans by candlelight, gave heat only to warm sore joints and cold hands. We were well aware that our light clothing was not at all suitable for the Russian winter. In response to public appeals for help from our all-knowing leaders in brown, sitting far away from the fighting in the east, a collection of clothing was organized for the soldiers of the Eastern Front. Warm ski sweaters, fur vests, sportswear, thick blankets, woolen socks and mittens, collected in this way by the Winter Relief Agency, first reached us in February 1942. At dusk, Wolf and I crawled across no man's land to the second Russian tank we had disabled, the only one of the 3 we had hit that had not burned. From the open hatch of the turret dangled the body of the young tank commander. Together we pulled the corpse out of the hole in the powerful armor, and I unbuckled his belt and took his gloves, pistol, and map tablet. We disassembled the gun sight, and I noticed that the crosshairs were set exactly on our 80 position. We opened the gun breech and fired a heavy shell from the chamber, letting it fall to the floor, and realized with a shudder that this was the same shell that would have destroyed our entire gun crew had we not been a fraction of a second faster. The tank was hit by one single shell of ours, which penetrated the turret just under the gun turret, killing the Soviet gunner instantly. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared on the horizon, the noises of the unrelenting front increased, and under cover of darkness, we crawled back to our position in the old stone house. On the way back, we spotted a drainage pipe running southeast under the railroad embankment, large enough for a 10-year-old to walk in without bending over. Inside the pipe, huddled closely together, sat several women and children. The heads and necks of the women and girls were wrapped in thick woolen shawls, and the figures seemed large and stocky in their thick quilted clothing. Frightened, with trembling lips, they pleaded water, and I replied that there would be water. A middle-aged woman, who seemed the most determined of them all, followed me with a bucket, and I led her to the well behind our stone house. She thanked me with an unintelligible stream of words, repeating thank you many times before hurrying toward the pipe. This small group of women and children had probably been sitting bent over for days in this confined space, where one could neither stand nor lie down with their legs stretched out. Unfortunately, this was the safest place for them during the fierce artillery fire that occurred from time to time in these parts, and we could offer no safer shelter. The next day, a Russian aerial bomb explosion blocked the entrance to this tunnel. The next morning, a Russian soldier ran past our barracks with a bayonet fixed to his rifle, his hat pulled low and his long-brimmed overcoat fluttering. From his hoarse shouts of horror, we could not tell whether he was drunk or mad. At a distance of 20 paces, I shouted to him, Stop! Hands up!" He stopped abruptly and looked around, finally stopping his gaze on us. Instead of throwing the rifle away from him and raising his hands, he pulled the trigger, firing at us from the hip, and rushed at us with bayonet drawn. The bullet struck the stone wall of the house behind us, and having no other choice, I raised my carbine and shot him at point-blank range. At noon, the commander of our company, accompanied by 2 other officers, entered our house. In recognition of our services in repelling yesterday's tank attack, he awarded each member of the gun crew the Iron Cross, with bandaged hands pinning the award to our uniforms. Over the Christmas holidays, our division received reinforcements in the form of a marching battalion. In one of the soldiers who arrived to be replaced, I recognized Hans from my native Württemberg. We had known each other since childhood and were now overjoyed that both of us had managed to survive the war so far. Hans had been shot in the neck during the early part of the Russian campaign, and after his recovery he was ordered to come here to us to be resupplied. It took the soldiers from the newly arrived unit more than 1 week to reach the front. At the first stage, they travelled in wagons for the transportation of animals, and the great distance from Perekop to the Crimea they covered on foot. As Hans said, all the soldiers were happy to be together with the masses again, because only in the company of fellow countrymen truly felt free. One morning after a reconnaissance of our defences, which was undertaken by a Soviet company, we came across a Russian wounded in the stomach, lying on a railroad embankment. Holding his wound with his hands, he was whispering for water. Amid his unintelligible pleas, we made out Christ spoken in a trembling voice. His pale, withered face was turned toward the leaden sky, and his eyes darted from one of us to the other, asking for help from the hated enemy from whom he had been taught to expect no mercy. Hans left, but quickly returned with 2 Russian prisoners, who on a stretcher made of army overcoats carried the badly wounded soldier to the medical station. There was a rumour in the company that a few days earlier, Divisional Chaplain Zatsker, while visiting the front, had happened to be near the forward positions and had been surrounded by Russian soldiers. Fortunately, there was one among them who spoke broken German, and Zatsker persuaded 10 enemy infantrymen to surrender and brought them with him to company headquarters. While on the battlefield, we knew little of the political and military events of the world. News from home was rare, and the theatre of war around us overshadowed everything else that lay outside our immediate sphere of existence. Overextended transportation lines were strained to the breaking point in supplying us with much-needed war material, and personal mail was considered a matter of secondary importance. When we learned that America had gone to war with Germany, we took the news calmly, almost indifferently. Many of the soldiers, regardless of education, now believed that only the greatest military skill and luck could bring us ultimate victory. However, despite the knowledge that we were facing the world's industrial giant, we did not at the time imagine the full dimensions of the might that would descend upon us. I recalled my father telling me that all was lost for Germany with the entry of the United States into World War I. In a circle of close friends, we discussed our fearsome situation. As infantrymen living in cells hollowed out in the frozen ground and fighting an enemy that grew stronger day by day, we began to realize that Germany had nothing to hope for in winning a war against the whole world. Nevertheless, our only hopes rested on the command of the Crimean army and on the proven abilities of Colonel General von Manstein. In the end, he also went the way of many of our most talented officers, refusing to bow to the impossible demands and absurd political doctrines of the dictator in Berlin. As the war drags on, Manstein will have his armies taken away from him, and we will often have to submit in battle to party men of the highest caliber with modest military talents. Some of the officers would be promoted to the rank of general for political reasons rather than for merit on the battlefield. Late in the afternoon of December 31, we learned from a messenger that the front would be moving back and the area we occupied was to be abandoned. During the night we dragged our cannon over the embankment and moved along the road leading northeast toward Kamishli. After several hours of travel we arrived at the newly established forward lines, and by morning we were at the company assembly point near Bakhchisarai. At first we did not understand why it was necessary to give up such a large territory for which we had paid so dearly with the blood of our comrades. Over the days of Christmas, 2 assault divisions penetrated deep into Russian-occupied territory. From our most forward positions at night, we could hear the fog warning sirens from Russian ships in North Bay, the road of life for the enemy. These deep wedges left our flanks dangerously exposed to the blows of the enemy, who continued to receive reinforcements by sea. The front line was therefore straightened to eliminate the possibility of being cut off from the main forces. On the outskirts of Feodosia, January 1942, an entry in the division's military chronicle reports that due to extraordinary events in the Crimea, it became necessary to reconsider the planned attack on Sevastopol. Only later did we learn of the danger in which the Crimean army itself found itself. December 25, the Russians near Kerch successfully landed a landing where, during the fighting for Sevastopol, was placed only one German division. Organized guerrilla units were ordered by the Soviet High Command to cut the supply lines leading to the Crimea along the corridor near Perikop, and on December 29 and the first days of January, the Russians landed in Eupatoria and in the harbour of Feodosia, stubbornly defending their positions. The division occupying Kerch successfully stopped the Russian invasion. Yevpatoria was recaptured by a reconnaissance battalion and the partisan units were repulsed. The 44th Infantry Division in Kerch, in order not to be encircled, fought its way westward as one Romanian cavalry division, rear units, and a weakened engineer construction battalion were available from the reserve. The situation for the army in the Crimea became threatening. In the first days of January 1942, the division marched through the main Crimean city of Simferopol to the north of Karasu Bazar because of the thaw, which turned all the roads into a bottomless quagmire. Advancement was only possible at the cost of incredible efforts of men and horses. It was often possible to see several horses in harnesses pulling automobile equipment. Reliable animals slowly but surely made their way through the mud, and mechanized transport was hopelessly bogged down in the slush. When further advancing combat units to the east, the artillery and most of the rear formations could only somehow move forward on the hard ground of the Karasu-Bazar-Stary road. The storming of Sevastopol cost the division so many casualties that its commander, Lieutenant General Zenzinich, felt it necessary to disband one battalion in each regiment to bring the remaining battalions up to fighting condition. On January 5, 1942, Zenzinich left the division and was succeeded by Colonel Lindemann, a brave and talented officer. The offensive was scheduled for January 15, and before the 132nd Infantry Division was tasked to break through the defences and through the height of 132.3 to reach the Black Sea and Theodosia Bay. On the left was placed reinforced 213th Infantry Regiment, and the sector on our right was given to the 170th Infantry Division. Shortly before dusk, we received a report of a Russian-prepared line of defence southwest of height 132.13. Under cover of two machine gun crews, we dragged our AT over the frozen no-man's land, keeping its shield forward. We took a position on a sloping slope from where we could see the Gulf of Feodosia. For the first time, we saw the Black Sea, a dark grey line on the horizon. We opened gunfire on a group of Russian vehicles and armoured vehicles, which carelessly positioned themselves in the open steppe at a distance of 1,500 metres from us. The Russians returned fire with tanks and heavy mortars, and shells began to burst on the crest of the slope behind us. During the firefight, an artilleryman of another rat of our company was killed by shell fragments. I carefully adjusted my scope and aimed our gun at a distant target. Again, we found ourselves in a situation where minutes decided the matter of life and death on the battlefield. If the enemy tanks discovered our position and were faster and more skillful than us, we would surely find our grave here on this hillside. Pressing my inflamed eye against the rubber ring of the telescopic sight, I actuated the trigger mechanism and followed the trajectory of our shell with my gaze, holding my breath as it disappeared from view against a small black target in the distance. The crew spilled out of the armoured vehicle, so our shot had hit the target and disabled the tank. The battery of 105mm guns of our division immediately opened fire, and in a few minutes the entire field occupied by the Russians was enveloped in a dense layer of dust and smoke. We continued to fire into this cloud with fragmentation shells. The Soviet positions, which otherwise would have served as a springboard for a counterattack on our newly established positions, disappeared in a barrage of artillery fire. A salutary darkness descended, enveloping both friend and foe and ending the artillery exchange. During the night, a reconnaissance platoon captured several prisoners who reported the attack being prepared for the next day. passed, a piercing icy wind from the east arrived. We lay in the trench next to our gun, huddled closely together, praying that it would not rain or snow. We spent the night in the frozen steppe near Feodosia, covered with raincoats and wrapped in the meagre remnants of our spare clothing.